This is the Middle-earth philosopher, where I talk about ideas, people, and relationships within Middle-earth and examine them from a philosophical point of view that people in that world may have held. This is the third part in my series on the Kin-Strife of the Gondorian Civil War, and it's going to cover the worldview of King Eldacar. So if you've gotten through all the rest of the videos with me on this, I do give you thanks for that. And I know all the names can be a bit confusing, so just a brief rundown real quick. Eldacar is the son of Valacar, which makes him the grandson of Minokar. There is no direct relation to Castamir at all whatsoever, so there's that. And the thing to know about Eldacar is that he is raised almost entirely in Rovanian during his primary years. Unlike his father, Valacar, who was primarily raised in Gondor and then went to Rovanian and adopted that culture, Eldacar, because of that decision, was raised primarily in Rovanian. So he is Rovanian by nature, by behavior, by who he sees himself and how he defines himself. In fact, he actually has two names. Yes, there's the Gondorian name of Eldacar, but he also holds the Rovanian name of, and bear with me on this, Vinitharia. So he is of dual culture as well, besides being essentially, I guess you could say, biracial. Now, this makes him, as I just said, of mixed heritage, of both Gondor and Rovanian blood, so to speak. And this is part of the problems that he is born into because of the decision that his parents made in getting married and choosing to take up the kingship of Gondor as well, which involved them having to move back to Gondor with their entire family. As I stated in my previous videos, Gondor has an issue with any mixing of the blood outside of Númenórean race. So there was a big problem with that, but for a long time it seems to have been sidestepped or at least accepted because, and this is my theory on this, that Valacar, since he was raised in Gondor, knew how Gondorians were. So he knew what to do, what not to do, and how to basically behave in front of the Gondorian nobles. And then in his private life, he could do basically whatever the hell that he wanted. Also, too, the first years of his marriage were spent in Rovanian before he moved back to Gondor. So it may have been a thing where the Gondorian nobles thought that he was just having a fling, or that he just needed to, get his urges out with some woman there, and then he would leave them behind, come back to Gondor, marry a Gondorian noble, and just proceed with the bloodline as usual. Obviously, this wasn't what happened. Regardless, Eldacar does eventually become king in 1432, and because of that decision, this is when war actually breaks out, because apparently the idea of a half-breed king basically was just too much for many of the Gondorians to deal with and accept. So a war breaks out during the first years of Eldacar's reign, as you well know, and Castamir is one of the leaders of this war and eventually, temporarily at least, succeeds in removing him from the throne because Eldacar, now on the back foot, decides to leave Gondor and return back to Rovanian, basically to get help because the forces that he had there either were not enough or got overwhelmed by the fundamentalists that they were fighting with. This results in one of his sons staying behind to, I guess, cover him, or maybe he was captured, and Castamir, being the violent person that he is, kills him. So at this point, there is now a grudge match between Eldacar and Castamir, and a few years later, now Eldacar does return, and he returns with an army from Rovanian composed of, I imagine, mostly from the tribe of his grandfather, as well as the tribe, any allied tribes, that may have sided with them as well, because Rovanian was composed of different tribes. Not only that because of Castamir's behavior and one-track mind in terms of his own personal allegiance to the southern areas of Gondor where he wanted to move the capital, a lot of the Gondorians who had fought with him turn on him and join with Eldacar and basically they all pull a power of friendship deal, I guess you can say, and end up winning the war. Eldacar kills Castamir, and Castamir's sons flee the Gondorian areas and leave for the far south of Umbar. So that's the short of the story as far as Eldacar's background and whatnot. But what about his worldview? What does it say about who he is as a person? Well, first off, we can say that he would have had issues adjusting to being in Gondorian culture because, as I've mentioned a couple times already, he is Rovanian as a person by nature and by culture. That's pretty much all that he knew before he went to Gondor with his family, so that's how he's going to think and behave, and everything how he acted in the war also indicates this, in terms of just being personally vengeful for the death of his son, as well as I believe he personally killed Castamir as well. Either way, even though his father would have known his way around the courts, Eldacar probably did not, and I imagine his family tried to help him with that, but again, his primary nature was Rovanian, and my understanding of Rovanian culture, as it was at that time, was that seems to be very blunt and not very big on being subtle, so he probably stuck out like a fish out of water there anyways. But since he is the son to the heir of the throne, he would have eventually been taught the elements of Gondorian culture, particularly the Númenórean bloodline and where that came from in terms of their ancient history. But I imagine that not being a real thing as far as Eldacar was concerned, because Númenor and everything associated with the Second Age has nothing to do with Rovanian, pretty much, because they weren't raised in that culture. They have little to no ties with that whatsoever, other than ancient bloodlines. And again, Eldacar's primarily, dealing with Gondor at this point, and Númenor's been long gone, by this time as well. The war itself may have came as something of a shock to Eldacar, perhaps, because again, all the nobles knew what Valacar, his father, had done, but no one had gone to war over it, and they only went to war once Eldacar himself took the throne, and suddenly there was a problem that they were willing to kill over. So I imagine that was a bit of a shock to him, and that may have contributed to his temporary defeat during the Civil War, where he had to retreat from Gondor and go back north. Now, the interesting thing to say about this philosophical difference between Eldacar and Castamir, and by extension you could say Rovanian and Gondor, is that you could say this was, in a way, a point in the war where it was between Rovanian and Gondor, in a way, because the primary elements of Eldacar's army comes from his homeland. So they were going to be the primary ones fighting alongside any allies who may have joined them from Gondor, but the main allies are going to be from people who he knows, the culture that he knows. So I think there was probably more of an allegiance to Rovanian at that point. He probably doesn't trust Gondor peoples that much because of the fact that so many of them turned on him. And given I believe the temperament based on that a lot of their tribes were pre-Rohan-like, he probably held a grudge. That's probably something that he remembered, that, hey, these people turned on me in my lowest point and they're my allies now, but how do I trust them in the future? Nothing like that is said in the books or anything like that, so please don't take this as gospel. I'm just making some assumptions here based on character portrayal and actions. That being said, though, he is willing to work with his Gondorian allies as well when he comes back. So that does say something of a more even temperament, I guess you can say, because he wasn't as violently prejudiced as they had been, and definitely not as Castamir was when the war had started. as well. It does speak for him that he proved to be a better king than Castamir was. More along the veins of his Gondorian fathers in a way, but perhaps as well of Rovanian. But topped off with his personal experiences being in Gondor, that, he probably did not like being seen as the alien and the foreigner, among the people of Gondor. And he didn't want to perhaps treat them the same way that he had been treated, because it had already caused enough damage and enough dead as it was, because the Civil War does a lot more damage to the Númenórean bloodlines in Gondor than any intermarriage does, which is the sad irony to that whole war. Now, it's said that after the Civil War, that Eldacar did not live a shorter life as everyone was afraid of, and he in fact brings a lot of the traits of his own culture into the Gondorian bloodlines and perhaps into the Gondorian training as well. If the latter part is true, then it's possible that he may have indoctrinated the Gondorian army into elements of the Rovanian armies that he was used to back in Rovanian, so that it was almost kind of I guess you could say perhaps a blended culture for a time. But regardless, he is also stuck with the task of having to rebuild Gondor after the devastating war. So this is also going to shape how he chooses to see the people of Gondor, as well as how he's going to choose how to react to them after the war is over. How do you treat people who have betrayed you? Who have not only turned your back on you, but played a part in killing your own family. Because again, Eldacar's son was killed by Castamir. That would be a tough choice, and that's a hard thing to deal with. But at the same time, it's not something that he could let dominate his worldview, because he was made king like his father and his grandfather. So chances are he feels that he was taught better than that, with the exclusion of Castamir himself, obviously. Either way, more than likely Eldacar, by the end of his life and after the end of the war, probably had a worldview of integration of the two cultures. That in order for the two cultures to survive, that Gondor and Rovanian had to more or less be on the same page, and one could not be second fiddle to the other, because a lot of that was what caused the Civil War in the first place, and allowing that mindset to fester in the minds of the Gondorian nobles and everything else. And again, because he appeared to live a very long time, like his ancestors of Gondor and Númenórean heritage did, that those facts would have aided in letting the Gondorians know that whatever it was that they were concerned about, it's not happening. It's unjustified at this point, because they don't see it happening in their lifetimes at least. So I think that would have made it easier for them to allow Eldacar to bring in Rovanian traits into their culture and into their military. And again, as I mentioned before, he also proved to be a much better and less violent king, ironically, than Castamir, who represented all the worst elements of Gondorian culture before Eldacar's reign, and everyone saw where that went, in Gondor. Everyone saw where that type of prejudice to that extreme and that radical loyalty to tradition that it caused, because by this point, a lot of the Númenórean bloodlines within Gondor itself are pretty much gone because of the violence that occurred here. So that too, ironically, would have helped Eldacar's, I guess you could say, rebuilding program of the Gondorian military and a little bit, I guess, of Gondorian culture. regardless, his worldview does eventually, I think, seep into the Gondorian subculture as well, because after this point, even though Gondor still sees itself as superior to everybody else, it isn't as violent or potentially violent as it had been before the Kin-Strife. Gondor seems to be more willing to work with people because, perhaps if you remember back in my video on Eldacar, Eldacar's grandfather, Minokar, who had started this whole trend way back when, by having concerns about, the East and the North, and that some of the Ravanian tribes were not being loyal. The whole thing started with that suspicion. This whole drama and everything for decades started with that mistrust. So that from Eldacar's reign onward, Gondor has to learn to trust outsiders, people who are not from Numenor. And again, even though they still have a superiority complex, it's not so bad that they're going to kill you over it per se. And you can see this in the interaction much later on with the Kingdom of Arnor, because in 1940, King Arifont of Arthedain, because Arnor had been broken up into 3 separate realms, and King Ondahor, I probably said that wrong, my apologies for that, both came together, realizing that some common force was organizing all these continuous wars against all the descendants of Numenor. So just the fact that Gondor, who had not spoken or had any communication with Arnor prior to that, since the Second Age, was willing to even talk with the kings of the North, also says something. And even though later on in 1973, that his son, Arduvi, does claim the throne of Gondor because Ondahir and his sons are killed in battle with the Easterlings, again. And he had married, I believe, into the family along those lines, that Gondor rejects it flat out, but they agreed to send aid to them and were in the process of getting ready to send an army to them before Arthedain was conquered and Arduvi had to go into hiding. So the point being to that was that Gondor tried. And they tried for a foreign, basically, element to their culture, because, again, even though Arnor and Gondor are both descendants of Numenor, their cultures are entirely different. They're in an entirely different place in terms of economic, military strength and stability, and they might as well be 2 separate peoples, with the one exception of they both live a long time, basically. But either way, I believe that the fact that Gondor was at least that open to it is the effects of Eldacar's worldview seeping into their mindset and into their culture at that time. And that is the legacy of the worldview of King Eldacar, as much as I can deduce from his actions and who he seems to be as a person.